Some people don't need to raise their voice to control a room. They don't argue. They don't demand attention. They don't even seem powerful at first glance. And yet, somehow, everything shifts when they are present. In the study of dark psychology, this phenomenon is known as silent control, the ability to influence others not through force or charm, but through psychological positioning, emotional restraint, and strategic silence. And what makes it so dangerous is this: you rarely notice it happening while it is happening. Most people assume influence comes from talking, but in reality, influence often comes from withholding. Withholding emotion, withholding reaction, withholding clarity. Because when someone refuses to show their internal state, your brain starts filling in the blanks, and what the mind cannot explain, it begins to overanalyze. That is where control begins. One of the core mechanisms behind silent control is ambiguity. Humans are not comfortable with uncertainty. When someone is emotionally unreadable, calm in conflict, silent under pressure, neutral in emotional situations, others naturally start trying to interpret them. Are they angry? Are they superior? Are they disappointed? This uncertainty forces attention, and attention is the first currency of influence. Because once someone occupies your attention, they are already inside your mental space, even without speaking. The second mechanism is emotional economy. People who use silent control often give very little emotional feedback. No strong reactions, no visible approval, no obvious rejection. Instead, they remain neutral, and this neutrality creates imbalance. Because in most social interactions, people expect emotional exchange, smiles, agreement, laughter, validation. When one person removes that exchange, the other person unconsciously starts working harder to earn a response. They begin adjusting behavior, changing tone, seeking approval. Without realizing it, they are now reacting to silence instead of intention. The third mechanism is presence without noise. This is one of the most underestimated forms of psychological influence. Some individuals don't need to dominate conversation. They dominate space. Their stillness becomes noticeable. Their silence becomes meaningful. And in group settings, others begin to subtly orient around them, watching their reactions, waiting for their input, adjusting their own confidence based on their presence. This is not because they are the loudest, but because they are the most uncertain variable in the room, and human behavior is deeply influenced by uncertainty. Another layer of silent control is selective engagement. These individuals do not respond to everything. They choose moments carefully. They may ignore small talk, but respond sharply to important points. They may remain silent during chaos, but speak only when attention is maximum. This creates a psychological pattern. Their voice becomes rare, and what is rare becomes valuable. Over time, others begin to assign more weight to their words, not because of content, but because of timing. But perhaps the most powerful element of silent control is emotional non-reactivity. Most people are easily readable under pressure. Stress shows in their face, anger changes their tone, fear disrupts their thinking. But someone with silent control remains steady, not necessarily because they feel nothing, but because they do not display it. And when someone does not emotionally react in expected situations, it creates psychological imbalance in others, because humans rely on emotional feedback to calibrate social behavior. Without that feedback, people become uncertain how to behave around them, and uncertainty leads to adaptation. Over time, this creates a subtle power shift. People begin to speak more carefully around them. They begin to seek approval indirectly. They begin to monitor themselves more closely, not because they were told to, but because silence created structure. There is also a deeper psychological principle at play: projection. When someone is emotionally unreadable, others begin projecting their own fears, insecurities, and assumptions onto them. One person may see confidence, another may see arrogance, another may see danger. But in reality, None of these interpretations are fully accurate. The silent individual becomes a blank psychological screen, and whatever people project onto that screen becomes their perceived reality. This is one of the most powerful and least understood forms of influence because it requires no direct action, only perception. However, silent control is not always manipulation. In healthy forms, it can be a sign of emotional discipline, stoic awareness, and internal stability. But in darker forms, it becomes strategic invisibility, using silence not for peace, but for positioning. The difference lies in intention. So, how do you recognize silent control? Not by what someone says, but by what changes in others when they enter a space. Do people become more careful? Do conversations shift slightly? Do eyes occasionally check their reaction before speaking? These are subtle signs that influence is being exerted without words. The Stoic philosophers valued silence for a reason. They understood that not every thought needs expression, not every reaction deserves display, not every moment requires noise. But they also believed silence should come from wisdom, not control. Because silence can either be mastery of self or a tool for mastery over others. So the real question is not who speaks the most, but rather who changes the room without speaking at all. Because in psychology, the strongest influence is not always visible. Sometimes it is simply felt.